Dr. Chris Stray is in so many respects a central figure in the field. And by the field, I really do mean classical studies, for lack of a more precise and more satisfactory term, broadly understood. He is, of course, someone who has reoriented, reshaped the way in which we go about writing the history of classical scholarship, but both the findings of his many and multifarious works and their fundamental methodological assumptions simply cannot be overlooked, in my view, by any practitioner in our field. It really is these sort of work that people who are working in different subfields, in different areas especially, should nonetheless be very much conversant with. Trying to summarize Chris's phenomenal scholarly output would be a tall order. I suppose there are two obvious starting points. One would be his groundbreaking 1998 monograph, Classics Transformed, Schools, Universities and Society in England, 1830-1960, which was a development of his doctoral thesis, revealingly a doctoral thesis in sociology. In 2018, he published a major collection of papers on the history of classical scholarship in the UK, Classics in Britain, Scholarship, Education and Publishing, 1800-2000. And the very breadth of his interests, encompassing really the 19th and the 20th century, and indeed beyond, is in itself something rather distinctive, if not even unique, about Chris's interests. But more broadly, I suppose, what really lies at the core of the tremendously diverse and rich scholarship of Chris Stray is the ambition of writing the history of classical scholarship from an historical, sociological, and political perspective, whilst never, of course, losing sight of the subject matter, of the problems, of the sources, of the themes that are at the core of that scholarship. And in this distinctive and fundamentally groundbreaking approach to the history of the field lies really a lesson for all of us, and a challenge for all of us. That, for one, I don't think historians of classical scholarship in other countries have quite taken up yet. The phenomenal scholarly output of Chris Stray includes, as we all know, a number of edited books, or indeed of co-edited books. I shall just single out a couple. One, co-edited with Lorna Hardwick, Companion to Classical Receptions, 2008, if I'm not mistaken, and two very recent ones, a major collection of essays on E.R. Dodds, rediscovering E.R. Dodds in 2019, and in the same year, another co-edited collection on Liddell and Scott, on the great Greek dictionary. This collaborative ethos of Chris's work is, again, a lesson and model and inspiration for all of us, and those who have indeed worked with Chris or even just sought his advice, or they saw that matter, will know exactly what I mean. They will know what generosity of spirit, what intellectual generosity Chris is a model of to all of us. And well, I suppose that that great quality of his is also apparent in a way through the collection of tributes to Chris's work that the Gruyter has just published, and Edithol was making reference to it yesterday, Classical Scholarship and Its History, literally hot off the press. And just to look at the lineup of distinguished contributors, and indeed at the range of topics that they well, share their thoughts about with Chris is, I think, telling of the admiration and gratitude that he's commanded across the field, and indeed of the inspiration that he's been to all of us. And it is also the sort of fellowship that has the added bonus of an intervention by the honorand himself. Very much a treat in itself. We are deeply grateful that myself as a chair and as an attendant, I know in this respect I also speak on behalf of the Gramsci crew, the Gramsci Research Network. We're very grateful that Chris has agreed to speak at this conference. We're much looking forward to his paper, a handout, extremely thought-provoking one, has been circulated, and I do hope you all have access to it. Perhaps a link can be posted through the chat function if it hasn't already been posted. Oh yes, there you go. Thanks very much, Emilio. And the title of his talk today is "The End of Eternity: A Short History of Long Classics." Chris, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Federico, for that over-generous introduction. Perhaps since you've mentioned the Festschrift, I might mention that the Honorand's contribution to it was a discussion of collaboration between classical scholars. So I very much appreciate your stress on the virtues of collaboration. And indeed, here we are now collaborating again. So thank you for that. I ought to begin perhaps by apologizing for reusing material I previously published. A Cambridge eccentric about to give a sermon in the university church told his congregation, "Some of you may have heard this sermon before. To them, I would say only that it is better to hear a good sermon twice than a bad sermon once." His innocent arrogance has a certain charm, but I hope not to be charged with such arrogance. My title is intentionally paradoxical. It refers to an ideological conception of classics as something unaffected by time or change, a conception whose authority was eroded in the 19th century, a time of change. In the 20th century, a withered vestige, an attenuated version of this conception persisted in Britain. To call this long classics is, of course, to evoke a comparison with long COVID, which we now know can appear to be defeated while persisting in modulated form over a long period. I should make it clear the analogy does not involve seeing classics as a disease. As Coleridge put it, no simile runs on all four legs. My approach to this topic is of that of a historical sociologist. How does this approach relate to the works of the man whose writings inspired the network which is hosting this meeting? Gramsci, of course, took superstructure seriously, as one might expect from anyone influenced by Benedetto Croce. In more general terms, he was interested in culture as well as in economy and society. That phrase, economy and society, reminds me of Max Weber, whose major work, Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft, is usually translated as economy and society. And of the three founding fathers of sociology, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, it is Weber, I think, who has most to offer us in pursuing a sociology of culture. Among later writers on this topic, the most influential has been Pierre Bourdieu, whose career began in the 1960s with statistically based work on the French educational system, and then developed into a systematic analysis of culture and class. His theory of symbolic violence argued that dominant groups exerted a control of meaning which made it difficult, if not impossible, for the controlled to realize what was happening to them. An interesting discussion of Bourdieu by the sociologist Michael Burawoy compares him with Gramsci in an imaginary conversation between the two. This is handout page 1, number 1. My engagement, says Burawoy, centered around the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who took Marxist hints seriously and became a theorist of superstructure. His notion of hegemony is the Marxist counterpart to Bourdieu's symbolic violence, but with a dramatic difference. If symbolic violence is domination not understood as such, hegemony was the opposite, domination understood as such. The one called for misrecognition, the other for consent. And I've added a note that misrecognition is the standard English translation of méconnaissance, a term that Bourdieu took from Lacan, and I don't propose to go into that any further. Bourdieu's influence is extended well beyond solid sociology. It can be seen, for example, in the historian Fritz Ringer's book, Fields of Knowledge, French Academic Culture in Comparative Perspective, 1992, which, and I apologize for this, is not, I think, on the handout. This followed other significant studies of European higher education by Ringer, beginning in 1969 with a book called The Decline of the German Mandarins, the German Academic Community, 1890 to 1933. And one of the figures who appears in this book more than once is our old friend Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Merlendorf. How can we use sociology to construct an idea of what classics is? I regard it as the generic product of a type of social action I will call classicizing, in which present interests operate on a repertoire of past meanings. The defining characteristics of classicizing can be summarized simply. It's an ideological process in which fixity is asserted in response to actual or perceived threat in order to achieve control over meaning. Typically, the permanent and generalized features of the classical are asserted at historical moments when change or relativity of value are perceived to threaten the making of authoritative sense. The dynamics of classicizing as a process are explored below, but first it's worth considering its nature as a generic phenomenon. The classics of 19th century Britain, I think, is a variant of the dominant European form of classicizing, what we call classics, the construction of exemplary visions from the resources provided by Greco-Roman antiquity. My major concern here is thus with European classics, but the generic nature of classicizing can be briefly illustrated by considering some non-European variants. In the Islamic world, the doctrine of Arabiya, the pure, homogeneous and unchanging language of the Prophet, is reiterated in an uneasy tension with the real world, in which Arabic usage varies between nations and between theological and secular contexts. And again, in modern Islam, those conservative groups who seek to impose a stiff and concealing style of dress on women present this as a return to tradition, a claim which the historical evidence appears not to support. One more example of particular interest is provided by the classicizing of Chinese culture in Japan. In 11th century Japan, where uniquely in world history, literary production was dominated by women, Chinese culture was taken as an exemplar. The stiff and angular characters of Chinese writing were regarded as more masculine, orderly, and impersonal than the relatively cursive and flowing Japanese script. Here, the ideology of permanence and generality is overlaid by that of gender identity, and the invocation of a distant exemplar as a defense against instability is entangled with the sexual politics of culture. One of the interesting aspects of this case is that Japan was near enough to China to be caught in the gravitational pull of its culture, but far enough away to develop relatively autonomous versions. A range of indigenous literary forms developed, which represented a self-conscious resistance to Chinese influence and which led to a nationalistic classicizing of Japan's own past, represented, of course, as an independent growth. The Romantic ideology that emerged in the late 18th century as a reaction to Enlightenment rationalism was itself challenged in the 1820s by a wave of literary classicism which spread across Europe in reaction to the destabilizing effects of Romanticism, an ideology which seems to undercut established notions of fixity and formal value. This classicism is represented, for example, in Browning's poem Pauline of 1832, and this is on your handout, page 1, number 2. Never morn broke as clear as those on the dim clustered isles in the blue sea, the deep groves and white temples and wet caves, and nothing ever will surprise me now. The last line encapsulates the essence of classicizing, the control of experience through the achievement of security which resists change and chance. Note, by the way, the curious juxtaposition of clear in the first line and dim in the second. A similar evocation, which also has a marine setting, can be seen in Edgar Allan Poe's poem To Helen, published the year before Browning's, and this is page 2, number 3. Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore that gently o'er a perfumed sea the weary, way-worn wanderer bore to his own native shore. On desperate seas long wont to roam, thy hyacinth hair, thy classic face, thy naiad airs have brought me home to the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. Lo, in yon brilliant window niche, how statue-like I see thee stand, the agate lamp within thy hand. Ah, Psyche, from the regions which are Holy Land. Here the certainty of home, the native shore, is coupled with the home provided by Greece and Rome, and then overlaid with a spiritual feeling that is both pagan and Christian. The architect Edward Falconer, who was a devotee of classical architecture, held to the same position when he wrote in 1851, this is page 2, number 4, the study of futurity is speculative. The present is wrapped up in that which is to come, and it is the past only which is complete. We are now in a state of progression. The future is shrouded in uncertainty, and we gain knowledge and experience only from the past. This statement came in his essay on the advantage of the study of antiquity and on excellence in art, in the journal he founded in 1851, the Museum of Classical Antiquities. But the future was indeed shrouded in uncertainty. Within 2 years, the museum had failed through lack of subscriptions. Falconer's statement reflects a widespread notion of the classical, which can be defined sociologically as a corpus of knowledge transmitted from the past, claimed to possess a special authority as the repository of exemplary cultural value. At the heart of such claims is the assumption that the classical possesses both permanence and generality. These properties provide an exemplary location in space and time, enabling it to resist the corroding effects of change and relativity, and hence to make authoritative sense of the present. Classics is thus a body of powerful meanings, but its authority is always stemmed in part from the social locations of those who have employed it. In European history, the study of classical antiquity has typically been linked to patterns of power and stratification, and its content has varied systematically in accordance with the interests of individuals and groups. The claims made for the cultural authority of classics have typically been advanced by social groups whose status is associated with the classical corpus through processes of self-recognition, reproduction, and exclusion. The 19th century. In the late Victorian and Edwardian eras, we find a new nervousness about the status of classics and formulations that are more defensive than confident. What had happened since the 1830s? Well, to put it very crudely, historicism and social change had happened. This can seem within the practice of classical scholarship itself, where the study of ancient history and archaeology began to be inserted into university curricula from the 1850s. Classical archaeology was promoted notably within the British Museum, where Charles Newson, after a decade of excavation in the Aegean and the Levant, was made keeper of the new Department of Greek and Roman Antiquities in 1861. In 1879, he became president of the newly founded Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies, whose main focus was on archaeology. This was the first body set up to promote a specific field of classical work, and its journal, the Journal of Hellenic Studies, founded in 1880, was the first British classical journal that's still published. The place of the new society in the symbolic field of classics was nicely plotted by the Oxford Homerist David Binning Munro in a review of the first volume of the journal. And Munro is on page 3, number 5. He pointed out that 11 of the 16 articles in this issue were archaeological, what he called classical scholarship, by which he meant work on language and literature, being represented by just one article and one review. And he went on, the society was brought into existence in London, which is, for obvious reasons, the centre of archaeological study. Hence it is dominated by the spirit of the British Museum rather than that of the Oxford and Cambridge lecture rooms. In his review, Munro quoted the Society's rules, the first of which declared that its main object was to advance the study of Greek language, literature and art, and to illustrate the history of the Greek race in the ancient Byzantine and Neo-Hellenic periods. Here he finds new features, and the first one was the idea of development, which impels us to look at the continuous history of a literature or a nation, rather than to dwell exclusively on brilliant epochs. Secondly, the idea of science, which tends to put all phenomena on the same level, rather than choose out this or that portion as especially worthy of study. Thirdly, the idea of nationality, which is satisfied by the long historical life of the Greek people. And he goes on to say, all these ideas are distinctively modern, and their influence may be seen in the province marked out by the new Renaissance. That province is not classical antiquity or even antiquity as a whole. It is best described by the word Hellenism, Hellenism every period and in every exhibition of its spirit. And the success which has so far attended the movement is due not just to the literary prestige of Hellenic studies, but still more to the consciousness that what they offer is in a supreme degree the conditions of scientific interest. A Cambridge scholar offered a more detailed account of the new spirit a few years later, page 3, number 6. The true keynote of the change which has come over classical studies is the introduction of the scientific spirit, the reverence of facts, the patient accumulation of facts, the cautious testing of each step which that spirit implies. Monroe's point about the contrast between development and brilliant periods may have been fueled by his personal focus on Homer, to whom no more than lip service was paid by those scholars for whom 5th century Athens was the peak of Greek civilization. For the Oxford scholar Alfred Zimmern, for example, and I quote, "This short half-century was perhaps the greatest and happiest in recorded history." The more fundamental point about development was that it undermined the crucial argument for classical antiquity, that it provides timeless exemplars of value, the core of the type of social action I've called classicizing. And once the notion of historical change was introduced, that centre could not hold. Monroe's second point referred to another corrosive of the classical ideal, what the late Frank Turner succinctly described as the amoral world of scientific naturalism. As this emerged in the later 19th century, it set up a powerful alternative to the world of literary and humanistic value of which classics have been a central part. Monroe's final point about nationalism pointed to another serious challenger to the world of universal value, which had been manifested in the history of Latin as a European lingua franca which underpinned the res publica Lutherarum. Nationalism went along with the shift to vernacular language and publishing, both of which had made significant advances in the 18th century. Particularism then worked against the universal value seen by so many as exemplified by classics, the bulwark against change and relativity. Vernacular classicizing can be seen, for example, in the celebration of ethnic or regional pasts within Britain. The most obvious example of this perhaps is the Celtic past, which has been recently the subject of considerable research exploring relationships with classical pasts. And I refer here, but not in the handout, which I apologize, to work by the two Kaminsky-Joneses. In this new world of change and relativity, both time and space change shape, and new conceptions of the classical have developed in response. One of the most accomplished and interesting was that of Gilbert Murray. Page 4, number 7. This is an extract from his very first book, A History of Ancient Greek Literature, published in 1897. The serene and classical Greek of Winckelmann and Goethe did good service to the world in his day, though we now feel him to be mainly a phantom. He's been succeeded, especially in the work of painters and poets, by an aesthetic and fleshly Greek in fine raiment, an abstract pagan who lives to be contrasted with an equally abstract early Christian or Puritan, and to be glorified or mishandled according to the sentiments of his critics. He is a phantom too, and as unreal as those marble palaces in which he habitually takes his ease. There is more flesh and blood in the Greek of the anthropologist, the foster brother of Kafirs and hairy Anos. He is at least human and simple and emotional, and free from irrelevant trappings. His fault, of course, he is not the man we want, but only the raw material out of which that man was formed, a Hellene without beauty, without the spiritual life, without the Hellenism. Many other abstracts are about us, no one perhaps greatly better than another, yet each has served to correct and complement his predecessor, and in the long run there may be no doubt that our conceptions have become more adequate. Let me just add that here, as later in what I'll be quoting, people are masculine rather than feminine. Murray's strategy is clear. Potential exemplars, past and present, are unreal phantoms because their potential is unrealized. There is a real exemplar in prospect, the man we want, to which all the phantoms are approximations which correct and complement one another. Hellenism has become not a product, but a process which accommodates to time by incorporating it. This is what Frank Turner called evolutionary humanistic Hellenism. Murray's reaction to change accommodates and incorporates it. Contrast then the reaction of John Clark Stobart in 1911 in his book, The Glory That Was Greece. This is page 4, number 8. My claim for the study of Hellenism would not be founded on history. I would urge the need of constant reference to some fixed canon in matters of taste, some standard of the beautiful, which will be beyond question or criticism. All the more because we are living in eager, restless times of constant experiment and veering fashions. The proper use of true classics is to keep them as a compass in the cross-currents of fashion. By them you may know what is permanent and essential from what is showy and exciting. The use of true classics rather than just classics is a bit of a giveaway, I think. Here eternity is reasserted in an attempt to resist the eroding power of change. Stobart's title, as you can see, was Take to Poe's poem To Helen, and so was the title of his second book, The Grandeur That Was Rome, published in the following year. Both books were very popular. Although they were expensive, they were heavily illustrated, which is one reason why they were expensive. And Stobart's text was relaxed and approachable, indeed at times even flippant. Later editions illustrated the paradoxical point I made about Falconer's Museum of Classical Antiquities, that a book seeking to resist the erosion of time was itself subject to change. The first edition of The Grandeur That Was Rome, issued after Stobart's death in 1933, introduced a greater emphasis on the Roman Republic. Stobart's concern to stress Greek freedom and Roman order had led him to pay much more attention to the empire than to the Republic. This edition was edited by Frederick Price, who became Keeper of Greek and Antiquities at the British Museum in 1936, but was forced to resign 2 years later during the scandal over the over-vigorous cleaning of what were then called the Elgin marbles, an untimely erosion indeed. The editor of the fourth edition of Stobart's Grandeur in 1961, and this is page 4, number 9, remarked on the status of the book as a historical document in itself. Some of the views expressed in the original version rest on attitudes and values different from those of the present day, and it is therefore in itself a valuable document of a past age, and evidence of something growing rarer in our times, the influence of Greek studies seriously pursued on a man of education, an amateur in the best sense of the word rather than a professional scholar. The eternal and universal appeal made by the ancient Greeks is thus demonstrated as it should be. I find the final sentence somewhat startling, but it seems to be recruiting change and relativity in aid of eternity and universality. Hopper, by the way, was Professor of Classical Archaeology at Sheffield, and thus a member of a productive department whose life seems on the brink of being ended by fiat. I've been looking at the symbolic field occupied by classics, and in particular by Hellenism, but we need to remember that such fields operate in relation to institutions, some of which I've just mentioned. And it should also be stressed that these institutions are not simply neutral channels of transmission, but have a degree of relative autonomy. The importance of the institutional realm was recognized in Monroe's statement that the Hellenic Society was brought into existence in London, the centre of archaeological study, and as he went on, therefore dominated by the spirit of the British Museum rather than that of the Oxford and Cambridge lecture rooms. The contrast there, I think, between the lecture room and the workshop, the department. The provision of schooling also saw changes in the late 19th century. As successive waves of aspirant social groups appeared, the continuing use of Latin, in particular as a social marker, led for pressure to access to schools that taught Latin. This ran in parallel with and was reinforced by the demarcations between schools with different leaving ages. The report of the 1864 Royal Commission on Endowed Schools identified schools without Latin and a leaving age of 14, with Latin and a leaving age of 16, and with Latin and Greek with 18 as the leaving age. This system was disrupted by the introduction of board schools run by democratically elected local school boards under the Elementary Education Act of 1870. These taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to age 14. But those were abolished by the Education Act of 1902, which established local education authorities and new municipal secondary schools in which Latin was taught and Greek optional. These schools marked the beginning of state provision of secondary schooling in Britain, almost a century later than it was introduced in France and Germany. And if I could just make a methodological point in passing, when we're writing this kind of history and deciding what the crucial dates are, the significant dates are likely to vary depending on the topic. Just to take one example, in the mid-1940s, for education, the crucial date is 1944, the passing of the Great Education Act. For politics, of course, it's the end of the Second World War, the year after that. In Classics Transformed, I identified the period from the abolition of compulsory Greek in 1920 to that of compulsory Latin in 1960 as the Age of Latin. Latin grammar functioned as the central exam path of academic rigor in secondary schools and was widely seen as the bulwark of a bourgeois society populated by civilized and self-controlled individuals. The formalism of grammar and its claim to generality can be seen as a diluted form of classicizing, a watered-down version of the imperial assertion of eternity and universality in the previous century. This, I would say, was the tail end of long classics. As a multi-layer system of schooling emerged, from the elementary and secondary system of the 1900s to the tripartite system set up in 1944, class, institutional and curricular divisions marched in parallel, just as they had in the 1860s. The tripartite system, in fact, was really a bipartite system, with grammar schools and secondary moderns kept apart by the 11+ examination, which sent people to one or the other. The small numbers of technical schools sat between them as a residual category. The centrality of formal Latin grammar sent Roman civilization to the margins, despite the struggle of some school inspectors to bring it back in, and the introduction of historical material into some textbooks. Let me just pick out a few textbooks which are listed in the handout on pages 5 and 6. Graham Jenkins's Latin for Today, which went into several courses, was first published in the US in the late 20s, and then came over here 5 or 6 years later. This course was based on reading rather than grammar learning, but it still retained elements of the formalist argument, as we can see from the introduction to the first book. Learning Latin means you develop a capacity for sustained effort, for perseverance in the face of difficulties, for orderly procedure, for accuracy, and for thoroughness. As far as I can tell, this statement was already included in the original American edition. It's very unusual for textbooks published in one country to be taken up in another. In this case, it was necessary for the American books to be changed to alter the order of the cases in nouns, since the traditional order changed in 19th century Britain had been retained in the United States. Benjamin Kennedy, author of the famous 1866 Latin primer, was asked to permit an American edition to be made, but refused to let the case order be changed, which is why he never took over in the States. Anyone who wants to pursue this might consult a paper by Sidney Allen and Charles Brink, which is listed on the handout, entitled The Old Order and the New, A Case History. Nice title. My next example, number 11, is not a course based on reading, but goes further, and it's actually a reader itself, Civis Romanus. And the titles of this and its successor, Pax et Imperium, show how Roman civilization, rather than Latin language, is at center stage. You can see something of its history. It was many times reprinted, and now, of course, Olcese and Carducci have hopped on board because it's out of copyright. More unusual to have a French translation. Even in readers, however, a persisting tension between discipline and culture can be seen in the editorial matter. This is number 12. Latin is not dull, nor is it difficult. The really important part is purely human. But nothing worth having is bought without some pain. The grammar must be mastered. There must be some lack of firmness in determination in the character of the boy, there we have him, the boy, who cannot or will not master it. This is probably the chief reason why it is, and no doubt will continue to be, a key subject for matriculation and an essential one for entry into the professions. But it's foolish to learn it merely to serve an end. If we do this, we shall miss a great deal that it has to offer us. So he's operating on several fronts there, several different arguments. But more traditional books were also published in the 30s, like Patterson and McNaughton's book, The Approach to Latin, which I shall mention later on. This is number 13. And I'll explain why I've picked that out when I come to it later. School textbooks were not the only publications aimed at learners or indeed teachers. And an example which deserves more investigation than it's had is a book called Latin with Laughter by Caris Barnett, who published under her married name, Mrs. Sidney Frankenberg. This is number 14. Her father was a school inspector who published a translation of Robinson Crusoe into Latin to interest his pupils. Barnett herself was educated at St Paul's in Somerville before the First World War, and at Somerville belonged to a writing group with Dorothy Sayers and others. She then worked as a midwife during the war and helped Marie Stopes with her birth control campaigns. Her own husband, curiously enough, owned a rubber company. Her first book was Common Sense in the Nursery in 1922. After giving birth to 4 children at perfectly spaced intervals, she brought out Latin with Laughter in 1931, illustrated and with translations of Latin passages provided. The book contains 39 lessons with Latin-English and English-Latin alternating. The only review I can find in the Classical Journal, in the Canadian journal Phoenix, commented that much of the content was ludicrous, but explained that the author believed that children would remember the ludicrous better than the commonplace. Later came a version without translations and a sequel, More Latin with Laughter. The book stayed in print till the late 50s. Now, Barnett was a remarkable woman whose life has been explored recently only because of her links with Marie Stopes and Dorothy Sayers. You can see the references there to the books by Debenham and Moulton in the handout. And it makes me wonder how many other such figures have been marginalised because of their gender or their politics. The way we look at classical antiquity has changed over the last century. From the 1920s, several books were produced in Britain and the USA bearing the words tradition, legacy, or heritage. Tradition, one might say, abandons eternity for temporality, but tames it by making it unidirectional, while downplaying change. From the 1960s, such terms gave way to the term reception. Charles Martindale's influential 1991 book, Redeeming the Text, argued that meaning is not something in the classical past that is passively received, as by tradition, but is created at the point of reception. Or perhaps I should say at a point of reception, since there are many such moments. This plurality has been emphasised by Lorna Hardwick and is also to be found in the title of the journal she founded, Classical Receptions, Journal, and in the collection we co-edited, Handbook to Classical Receptions. We need a history of classical reception studies, one which would not only trace competing and successive ideological positions in the field, but also its penetration of institutional sites. This began here and in North America in relatively low status universities and colleges, and its recent rise can be seen in its adoption by places like Harvard and Yale, Oxford and Cambridge. At the university level, radical views were long marginalised in classics. In the 1790s, we can find classical scholars who supported the French Revolution, but were imprisoned or expelled, as in the case of Gilbert Wakefield, although, perhaps more interestingly, Richard Pawson avoided such a fate. Hall and Stead, in their splendid People's History of Classics, discuss some of these scholars, and others might be added who are less obvious. For example, John Tweddell, a celebrated Cambridge verse composer and political radical, who went to Athens and died there at age 30 in 1799. In the 20th century, the few classicists who could be called left-wing, including Benjamin Farrington, George Thompson and Robert Browning, did not form a coherent group, although they did have links with one another and with scholars who were politically nearer the centre, like F.M. Cornford and E.R. Dodds. The correspondence surviving between Dodds and Farrington is marked by a tension over Farrington's loyalty to the Communist Party. That between Cornford and Thompson was affected by Thompson's tendency to adopt extreme positions from which he was reluctant to retreat. The history of this group has yet to be told, unlike that of the scientists portrayed in Gary Worski's book, The Visible College, the scientists Lancelot Hogman, J.D. Banal, J.B.S. Haldane, Hyman Levy, and Joseph Needham. And this is part of a more general separation and sidelining of the history of the humanities, only recently and partially reversed by the Amsterdam-based activities of the History of Humanities project led by Rents Bod and the Vossius Centre for Humanities and Science. The lack of contact between the histories of science and of classics is especially regrettable in the case of Farrington, since he produced pioneering work on ancient science. And he was in fact the lead speaker at the inaugural meeting of the British Society for the history of science when it was founded just after the Second World War. His work on ancient science also endeared him to a younger left-wing classicist, Moses Finlay, as can be seen in Finlay's unusually warm obituary of him. After Farrington returned from his job in Cape Town in 1935, he spent the rest of his career at Swansea. His provincial location was characteristic of left-wing scholars compared to the more prestigious positions of Dodds at Oxford and Cornford at Cambridge. Another Marxist scholar, Robert Browning, ended up at Birkbeck, a metropolitan location, but in some ways marginal because of the nature of the college. Browning's career as a Byzantinist may help to explain why he's less well known than some of his fellow classical Communist Party members. He went from Glasgow to Balliol in 1935 as a Snell scholar. In 1946, Kenneth Dover, then a fellow of Balliol, called him the best linguist I've ever known. Browning taught at UCL, but in 1953 applied for a fellowship that had become vacant at Balliol. Dover reported that there were, and I quote, 2 good candidates and a third coming soon, who's Balliol and very good, but a communist. He commented that on his record on paper, there is no doubt that Browning is head and shoulders above the rest. I went round to see Frankel, and he said, a superb technician with no heart. Don't have him as a college tutor. In Dover's view, Browning was easily the most highly qualified candidate, but he remarked that if it comes to a vote, practically all the fellows will definitely vote against electing a man who's a member of the Communist Party. Gordon Williams was elected. In the late 1960s, Browning supervised my abortive attempt to work on a Roman Republican topic at Birkbeck, but not for long. The awful truth is, I think that neither of us knew enough about the subject matter. His preferred teaching method, which he ascribed to Oxford, was to be sent essays which he then brought into college for me to read out. And I must admit there were times when I wondered if he'd actually read them himself. In the 19th century, a lot of people learned about classical antiquity outside the universities. Some of them learned, certainly early in the 19th century, in dissenting colleges, whose varied history will be comprehensively surveyed in a forthcoming book edited by Isabel Rivers. Some taught themselves, using the books produced from the beginning of the century, using advances in printing technology, and designed to appeal to a growing market of working class readers. Autodidacticism has hardly been systematically explored. As you can imagine, much of the evidence is scattered, or unpublished, or both. Hall and Stead, however, have made a very good start in their People's History, whose index contains nearly 30 entries on the subject. And I'm glad to find that classical autodidacts are currently being researched by Melissa Addison of St Andrews, who is, I believe, with us today. Subalternity, as one might call it, can be identified in working class contexts of aspiration and rejection, but also more generally in the condition of pupils as subalterns. The Molesworth books of Geoffrey Willans, which appeared in the 1950s, belong to a long tradition of books about school life, but were given added edge by Ronald Searle's illustrations. These included portraits of Latin parts of speech depicted as wild animals captured by Benjamin Kennedy, author of the famous Latin primer, who is shown as a big game hunter. It was this world in which children tried to make their own sense of what adults told them that I tried to explore in my paper, The Smell of Latin Grammar. References on page 7, number 15. Its subtitle returned to the psychologist Liam Hudson's work on what he called contrary imaginations, a phrase which he'd taken from Spratt's History of the Royal Society. But it tried to give it a radical twist by referring instead to contrary imaginations. That is, children's ways of thinking are not just different from each other, but resistant to those that adults try to impose on them. One way into the history of classics in schools is to look closely at crucial moments of change. A case study of the reception of the Cambridge Schools Classics project in the late 1960s, for example, shows what happened at the micro-institutional level, the chalk phase. My own experience of teaching at this came in the late 60s. The Cambridge project, set up in 1965, had produced both a Latin course and a course in non-linguistic classical studies. The latter course specified group work for pupils and makeshift arrangements were necessary to allow for this. I experienced this as a teacher between 1967 and 1969 in a two-form entry school which stuck to more conventional methods for Latin in the A forms, but introduced the Cambridge Classical Studies course for the B forms. Their classrooms full of heavy individual desks, now had 8-foot by 4-foot pieces of chipboard, what would now be called MDF, stored at the back, ready to be dragged onto desks at the start of a lesson and dragged off again 40 minutes later. The whole notion of cooperative group work was novel. The established system throve on competition and anal possessiveness. A pupil's desk and his knowledge were both private property, and teachers felt uncomfortable about looking inside them, even if they suspected they contained banned objects. The pupils themselves were mad keen on competition, and if an exercise was not to be marked, their faces fell and their attention drooped. Classics, or as one teacher called it, Latin without the language, meant easy stuff about myths and social life, with lots of drawing and work cards, and was given, as I've said, exclusively to the B forms. Teaching Latin to the clever kids in the A forms was different. The Cambridge course was not used, and I had to teach from the book I've referred to already, The Approach to Latin. This was written by 2 Glaswegian teachers and published in Edinburgh, and might be called a reformist update as conceived by traditionalists. This was a book heavy both in content and in weight. I met a headmistress who said that she wouldn't allow it to be used in her school because she thought it was too heavy for the girls to carry. Worthy features like paragraphs on social life and rather blurred photos were sprinkled through what was basically the mixture as before. A photograph of Roman pens and inkpots was only marginally better focused than the British Museum postcard of a Tibetan leather bucket, made famous by Mary Beard as the least popular postcard in the museum's history. There were proverbs to interest the reader and perhaps give a glimpse of the Roman soul. The one I remember was, laborare est orare, to work is to pray. The soul this reflected was perhaps Presbyterian rather than Roman. But the first 6 chapters took us through 6 grammatical categories without giving much vocabulary. Discipline still ruled. A sense of oppressive boredom and futility hung over the classroom, and several times a week someone would pipe up, "Please sir, why do we have to learn Latin?" The old answer that you might need it for university entrance was no longer available. In 1988, classics suffered at both school and university levels. The Barron report into university departments led to the closure of some, including Aberdeen, Hull and Lancaster. Human costs were involved as well as educational. One classicist who was obliged to move to a different university took her own life. At secondary school level, the 1988 Education Act introduced a new national curriculum which set up a distinction between core and peripheral subjects, classics being relegated to the latter category. This left classical provision largely in the hands of independent schools, which, like schools in Scotland and Northern Ireland, were not subject to the new rules. So much for the national curriculum. This strengthened, of course, an existing divide in classical provision. Latin is currently available, as far as I know, in 13% of state schools and 60% of independent schools. Since then, a variety of initiatives has been founded, some trying to establish Latin in primary secondary schools, for example, the IRIS project, others rallying support for classics more generally, like Classics for All. And a notable development has been alliances between schools and universities, such as Classics in Universities, Classics in Communities, which links Oxford and Cambridge with the IRIS project. A central feature of all this activity in the last 30 years has been the final abandonment of formalist justifications. Arguments for Latin learning as a help to learning other subjects now draws on research into language learning and not on the formalist mental training ideology of long classics. Another welcome feature is the use of communal and cooperative strategies in organising to promote classics. For example, at the beginning of next month, I can see a meeting advertised under the title Towards a More Inclusive Classics. And such activities have, of course, been powerfully aided by the growth of online resources, which have come into their own in the age of COVID, as the present meeting shows itself. What this period lacks is an adequate historiography. Martin Forrest's 1996 book, Modernising the Classics, did a good job for the period 1960 to 90, but we need an exploration of the following 30 years. And if oral evidence is to be collected, then time is quite short. People of my generation, who can remember the foundation of JAT and the early 1960s, and the Cambridge Latin course later in that decade, will not be available, and compos mentis, for much longer. To conclude, I tried to offer a sociological perspective on some of the subjects of this meeting: class, social control, and resistance. And as you can see, some of them have been already discussed by Edith and Lorna. I began by looking at the ideology of classics as an eternal and universal exemplar, and then followed the erosion of this force of formation in the 19th and 20th centuries, the period of long classics. My discussion of textbooks in the interwar years and of teaching and learning in the 60s may perhaps serve as comparative material when we come to look at classics in schools in today's programme. As Lorna said yesterday, we need comparison and collaboration, and in terms of the organisation of our work, I think the two go together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for this wonderful lecture. Plenty of big ideas, plenty of material, a long reading list for many of us to pursue, I'm sure. And indeed a number of pathways for more work to do. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there'll be many questions and comments. So I would ask people to either raise their hand, their virtual hand, I suppose, or to register their interest in asking a question via the chat function, rather than actually asking the question via the chat, unless your microphone is not working. So I'm opening the floor. I see a raised hand from Barbara Goff. Please, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was tremendous, as always. I was just intrigued in the closing moments of the paper, because obviously you had talked about ideology quite persistently while talking about the 19th century and even, I think, the early 20th. So is it correct to speak in some ideological terms now? Or obviously, I'm not going to say, have we moved beyond it? I guess I would have to say, what does it look like? How would you characterize it now?
What a very good question, which means I'm not sure how to answer. I suppose the picture, that, as I see it, is that what I've been talking about is exclusions and attachments. And the history is one of the dissolution of those. So we're now left out in the open, and as I think Lorna emphasised, the detachment of classics from patterns of compulsion and patterns of class attachment has created difficulties simply because it's led to lack of provision and to lower numbers. But being cast off like this is being cast adrift only in the sense that it gives us freedom, freedom to look at classical antiquity ourselves and to ask ourselves what we value in it and how we can best share this with either pupils or general readers. What the ideological basis of that is something I'm really not sure of. What do you think?
Oh, that's an unfair question. What do I think? I think probably I'm going to have to work on that some more. I was just wondering to what extent we now line up our discipline with a sort of wider post-imperial, multicultural take perspective, and if that is what we need to do. And then again, I suppose I would sort of say, okay, what are the ideological bases of that? And I think with somebody, I've forgotten exactly who it was yesterday, I would probably eventually talk about our need to ensure our own survival, and obviously, you know, wonder to an extent how much good faith we can claim for that. But those are, you know, very large questions, and I want to reiterate how much I appreciated your contribution.
Thank you.
Could I ask a quick question in that connection? Starting from the "Sir, why do we need to learn Latin?" Quote, and linking it up with another chunk of your handout, indeed of your talk, that passage by Wormold, that the preface to Lines Balbus, right? There's a great deal to object to in that paragraph. And then there is that final sentence, which, well, I'm just going to read out. it is foolish to learn it, Latin, merely to serve an end. If we do this, we shall miss a great deal that it has to offer us. How frequent is that sort of statement in later pedagogical literature on Latin and Greek?
You mean later than?
Yeah.
Later than Balbus?
Yes.
My impression, and I haven't really kept up with this, is that such statements are not very common. Wormald there was, as you can see, trying to operate on several different fronts, and he can't abandon the necessity argument. He can't really believe that somebody can learn Latin without doing a lot of hard work and suffering. I suppose the best place to go to look would be to look at the Cambridge Latin Project materials and to see what they say by way of preface. And I actually don't know what that is, and possibly there are people here who do. But I think just to go back to what I said about needing historiography, and I don't know whether Martin Forrest could have answered that point in his book, but I've had a long history of looking at classical textbooks, and most of them being 19th and early 20th century. But if the same kind of exercise were followed between, say, the 30s and the 90s, then that would be very interesting. And I'm sorry that I can't really answer.
Oh, thank you very much. I think that in itself is very instructive. It suggests that it's certainly not a prominent theme, shall we say.
I think not.
Thank you very much, Chris. There's an intervention from Lorna Hardwick, please.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this. As ever, there are heaps of things I'd like to ask about, but could I focus on something that's really practical? You talked at the end of your paper about the need for research on what is coming out of the most recent period of developments in teaching and research, and the importance of capturing the views of people who may not be around all that much longer, etc. Now, I wanted to ask you about the nature of the evidence, given that hardly anybody writes letters anymore. We all communicate by email and social media and so on. What would be your advice to people who are involved in driving debate and change and are working practically with students and the wider public now? What would be your advice on what they could, as it were, record, leave, make sure survives, so that your successors as historians, in the next generation, have actually got, data and evidence to work on? Is there anything that we can all usefully do to actually record these moments of crisis, decision, etc.?
Thank you. That's a very good point. And as you say, the kind of material that one could find for the 19th century and part of the 20th is no longer going to be available, I think. Well, one possible answer would be based on what's happening to our meeting today when sessions are being recorded. And it may be that the video recording of meetings like this will provide useful material. Offhand, the only other suggestion I can make is that those of us who've played a part either in making policy or writing its history should put our memories onto, if not paper, then onto disk. But encouraging this would involve, I think, some kind of project where people would be asked to send in material. There's a very strong 19th century tradition of memorializing people, so that if a prominent scholar died, for example, you could expect a fat volume, even 2 volumes, to come out after the death. People who had received letters from that person would be asked to send them back in, either on loan or permanently, and the loyal ex-pupil would then construct the volume. That's a tradition that's already fading in the years just before the First World War, and it becomes very uncommon after that. And given the realities and the economics of publishing, it's not likely to be revived, at least not in paper form. But of course, if one set up a website for that kind of material, then I think it would be possible for people to send in material, but someone would need to run it, someone would need to fund it. So those are the only things I can think of offhand. You've got other thoughts, though, I'm sure.
Right. Well, I think it's something I'd have to pursue with you offline, but I think undoubtedly you put your finger on it in terms of funding and hosting and so on.
Yeah.
Whether that is the kind of project that is going to be attractive to current funders, you know, given the nature of their guidelines and so on, I don't know, but maybe that's something that we could sort of take forward, and also take on board the ideas that other participants today might have about the best way of setting up that kind of thing. It seems to me there would need to be a sort of collaborative effort between hosts, leaders, as it were, and a whole myriad of people who would, you know, make sure that an accessible record was kept of key moments and so on. And people might not always want at that time to record, you know, all the numerous toings and froings and horse trading and so on that was going to go on. Because it's very clear from what you've been saying that, and from Barbara's intervention, that there are compromises that have to be made in order to, if you like, keep the subject going, and yet at the same time enable it to fulfill, you know, the kinds of potential in the modern age that we need to work towards. And clearly that's going to be some very, very detailed discussion and debate about that. But, you know, thank you very much for making that suggestion for us to work on.
Thank you, Lorna.
I do hope this is the starting point of a much needed discussion. Yes, thank you very much. We have a question from Judy Hallett and one from Henry Stead afterwards. Judy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Chris. And I appreciate in particular your advocacy of these memory projects. For those of us who still have the wits about us and the relevant documents to share where we've been at different points in the past. My concern is with the accountability of these projects. And I've been involved in a number, as you know, where important voices have been excluded and serious misrepresentations of facts have occurred. And it's my feeling that the standards of accountability, if we want to call it that apply in our engagement with classical texts and materials when we publish in learned journals and give papers, but those same standards don't necessarily always apply when individuals talk about their own and others' efforts in determining how classics is taught and valued. How do we make what we do in remembering more accountable?
That's not just a rhetorical question.
No.
Well, yes, it's very good you brought this up, Judy, particularly because people in Britain, I'm less sure about Italy, would have an experience different to the one that you've had and other people have had in the States. To put it very simply, in Britain, certainly, the fact that one is Jewish or black has not made much difference to the experience of writing this sort of history, whereas in the States it's very different. And of course,
yes,
as you well know, in one case of someone who is both black and Jewish. I think the only answer really is that these things should be discussed openly, and that there should be some kind of democratic control, and I mean democratic within the collegiate group of classicists that is interested in this kind of thing. But it's a matter of educating people's attitudes, I think. And I think one thing that would be very helpful would be for you and others in the States to remind people in other countries of the lessons that have been learned and the obstacles that have been confronted in the States. So that, I mean, this is another comparative exercise, if you like the sort that Barbara Goff was quite rightly mentioning.
Yeah.
That indeed, Lorna mentioned yesterday that we need comparison. So I think that kind of comparison and making people aware of how different the situation is in other countries would be a way to start. Thank you very much for that.
Do you want to make a follow-up comment, Judy, very quickly? Or?
I think he's absolutely right. And I think it's important that we go public with a lot of our concerns that we haven't. And it's difficult because causes ideological and personal rifts, but I'm a big believer in trying to be accurate and inclusive rather than partial. So it was absolutely, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Henry, please.
Thank you, Chris. I really enjoyed your paper. It was fantastic. I loved hearing about Robert Browning in particular, and I think I understood rightly that he taught you. Is that right, or did I mix that up?
No, you're quite right. When I was teaching in the late 60s, I enrolled as a research student at Birkbeck. It was a project on Roman law courts, and he was my supervisor.
Okay.
But for the reasons I mentioned, it didn't really work out. And the only reason I know of all the detail about him is because I'm working on Kenneth Dover, whose family have lent me his family papers, including letters home from the 30s to the 60s. And that's where I get that kind of detail. A nice example, actually, of the kind of material that, as Lorna was pointing out, we're no longer going to have at our disposal.
Yeah, that's right. I wonder if the email might fill in quite a few of those gaps, but I guess we have to be careful on how we record those.
Yeah.
My question really, though, Chris, is about marginalization because of people's politics. And something Edith said, I think, in her paper was about how people no longer have to, or feel the need to, perhaps, suppress their politics in their scholarship, or at least aren't going to be persecuted directly for that. And so my question is if this is no longer the case, which I think it might be in different countries and different communities, of course, but if we take, for example, like here, maybe in Britain, that this is no longer the case, we can obviously recover the contributions of those who were excluded or marginalized in the past. And that's something I think like your work on Browning and things like that is really helpful for. But then the next step is, what do we do now? Do you welcome a kind of openly politicized ideological approach to scholarship, to classical scholarship in particular? Or is that something you'd be wary of?
I would be wary, but I would feel it was wrong to try to stop people doing it. And I would think the thing to do would simply be to apply to their work the standards one would do to any other work. I can remember reading George Thompson's Aeschylus in Athens while I was being supervised by Robert Browning. And at one point I mentioned this to him and said I found it a very difficult book to read because to me it seemed more like a primer of Marxism than a study of Aeschylus. He smiled. But that would be an example, I think, of the saturation of a text about the ancient world by political commitment and so on. A lot of people would say that that book was spoiled by its ideological assumptions, but I think people should make up their own minds. And if and look at the relationship between the Marxism and the study of tragedy. Certainly true that nowadays, I don't think one very often finds heavy and explicit political commitments at play in work on the ancient world. Edith, of course, is an interesting example. Very much a tribunus plebis, but it's something she wears on her sleeve, and it hasn't stopped her doing all sorts of admirable work on Greek tragedy and other topics, Aristotle, which are recognized as being very good simply by ordinary standards. And I'm not sure that has anybody attacked her for talking too much about the oppressed?
I can't speak for her, but I think...
Can one talk too much about the oppressed?
I imagine, you know, there are differences between open attack and more quietist kind of
yes.
obstructions, for example.
Yes. So not funding somebody or not publishing their book or refusing to allow it to be reviewed, that kind of thing. Yes, that's the really insidious thing, which that's the kind of history that I enjoy exploring. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's a question from Emilio.
Yes.
Got a message from him through the chat. Please.
Thank you, Federico, and thank you very much, Chris, for these fantastic lectures. Lots of things to think about. I have a short comment on the issue of letters and emails. Doing my work on the Walban papers, I've stumbled upon Browning actually talking with Averil Cameron. I stumbled upon Browning. But the comment is actually on the material. I've found loads of printed out emails in the Walban papers from the last, I don't know, 15 years of his life, 10 years of his life, something like that. And Dorothy has collected everything. So emails might help, but I think also socials. I mean, the sources are going to change, of course. It's not desperate. My question, anyways, is on something else. It's your quote of Arthur Tilley, on the scientific spirit and scientific approach to classical scholarship. And I want to look back to what we were discussing last night with Lorna after a lecture on the paradigm and paradigm shift. In this case, I think Tilley here is talking about what we might define with Kuhn a paradigm shift. So a way to approach classics through a scientific look, a scientific spirit. After a long quasi-positivistic phase in which, you know, methods like prosopography or Quellenforschung have been regarded as the tools to get to find out the truth that's outside, that we can somehow reach, etc., etc. We are now undergoing a massive change, and there's been, I think, a crisis that's going on, that has been going on for a while. So methodology is always presented at the beginning of books because are conflicting. In Kuhn's terms, scientificity, the scientific status of a discipline is given by the fact that there is a paradigm. Do you think the new inclusive classics, the ideas that we're trying to put forward here, have the potential to reach a paradigmatic status or not? Thank you.
Interesting question, and I'm not sure that I know the answer. I would have thought that we're, in methodological terms, we're in an age of pluralism. And even the meaning of something like scientific is now not what it was then. I mean, it's interesting in a way that when you think of the growth of science and its influence in the late 19th century, it's quite interesting that you've got classicists talking about it, who themselves may well have had little access to the work of scientists or the discussions between scientists about scientific method. Tilly, for example, was a contemporary of James Clerk Maxwell, but I don't know that he met him. They were in the same university. And of course, since then, there have been quite a lot of discussions about philosophy of science and history of science, and discussion about the different meanings of science and the different kinds of scientific method. So I think all I can say is to repeat that I think we're in a pluralistic age. And in a way, this perhaps goes back to the point I tried to make about the residualizing of the humanities within historiography, where history of science is a very well developed and organized field. You know, there are centers for the history and philosophy of science. There are journals and so on. And I think one thing we might well do is to try to get classicists and scientists, or at least historians of science, to talk to one another more, so that we haven't just got stereotypical notions of what is one or what is the other, but we engage in some kind of discussion. Perhaps another project for the research network to think about. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting question.
Thank you.
Thank you. More questions, comments?
They're exhausted.
Well, if I may, actually, partly on this very note, could you expand somewhat on, suppose, your assessment of the role of Moses Finley in the trajectory you've been sketching? And of course, you were also involved with the Lactor initiative, weren't you, at some point? But more generally, you're thoroughly conversant with Finley's work, both sort of academia-facing and, well, also with the work intended for the rest of the world, I suppose. His newspaper articles and so on.
I should say that I was taught by Finley at Cambridge. I'd been reading sociology when I was in the sixth form at school, and when I got to Cambridge, carried on doing this. And I caused some difficulty in my college by writing directly to him, asking him if he would supervise me for ancient history in part 2. And they were very cross about this, but on the other hand, he said yes. And they'd asked him before and he said no. So I was let off the hook. So I got to know him quite well, and I was a member of the JACT Ancient History Committee when he was chair. So we had a fair amount of contact. The book about him, edited by Dew and Osborne, has some very interesting things in it. And I was particularly pleased to see that Mary Beard talked about his work, as you say, facing the outside, the non-academic world. He was an enormously prolific journalistic writer. He'd done a lot of political organizing and commenting when he was in the States, so it's the less surprising perhaps because of this. But I think it made him a very important person in the 60s and 70s, particularly the 60s, because he was both becoming a very significant player in the field of classics, and particularly ancient history, at the same time as becoming a public intellectual, and also a journalist who became a presence in newspapers, certainly, and nowadays I think would have been a kind of Beard figure, possibly, on television as well. And he participated in, and I think at some points pioneered exercises in publishing genres between academic books and newspapers, that is to say, public series, the Chatto and Winters series that he edited. And his work for JACT on the Ancient History Committee was also important because, and I could actually see this happening, sitting there, there were academics involved who had fairly unreconstructed ideas about teaching and learning and marking and setting and so on, who were pulled into a different phase, as it were, by his influence, because he was clearly such a powerful intellect and such a persuasive person that they felt there was a kind of hysteresis going on. You know, they had to move their positions a bit. They couldn't just ignore him. If I had said something like that, I would have been just brushed aside like a mosquito. But he had to be taken more seriously. He became, I think, in his old age, critical, sometimes destructively critical of other scholars, particularly within Cambridge. But he is certainly one of the great figures. And he's also, of course, of extreme interest to the historian of classics because he was American and because he was Jewish. I've written quite a lot and done quite a lot of work on the refugees, the Jewish refugees of the 1930s, and it's interesting to see him as a kind of a late outbreak of that same kind of phenomenon. Expelled from the States, of course, not because of his ethnicity, but because of his political views.
Thank you very much.
Could I just add a very brief comment to that? Thank you, Chris. Moses Finley actually supervised my postgraduate work for a considerable period when nobody else would. And if he hadn't, I think I would have found it very difficult to, to pursue an academic career. The other thing was that when I was working through my topic for my thesis, he helped me actually in a very understanding way to grasp the fact that if I pursued the topic I wished to do at that time, A, nobody would listen or publish it, but B, more important, I hadn't got the necessary skills, particularly interdisciplinary skills, to do it. And that was very hard to take at the time. I spent a very hard 6 months working through all that. But it was constructive criticism because it actually set out a program as to what I should do, sort of in an autodidactic way, if you like, over the next 10 years while still pursuing my thesis. So a lot of the stuff that's happened in the intervening years would not have happened if he hadn't taken the time and trouble to actually take my work to pieces, but also help me to build it up again.
Can you say why other people didn't take it seriously or wouldn't have done?
Well, I think there were a number of things, partly because I hadn't pursued the conventional route, into the field. Partly because he thought that what I was aiming at was ahead of its time in a funny sort of way. But that is not to sort of, project myself as a sort of unsung, heroine of the time, which would be totally pretentious. You also absolutely made me realize and understand why it was that I didn't have the capacity to do that work at that time, but I could build that capacity. And I think that was the most important thing I learned in that dreadful first 6 months of being supervised by Moses.
Yeah, thank you.
It certainly made me think through whether or not I really wanted to do that kind of work or not.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
What was your original thesis topic, Lorna?
Well, the actual thesis topic that I wrote on, which, I mean, when I think of it, I sort of cringe in shame, actually. It was the emergence of political thought before Plato. So in other words, I was already looking at, literary texts for ideas, and I did that specifically in relation to elitist ideas. My original topic had been a sort of huge one, that would have taken 20 volumes and 50 years to do. And I don't think I've got beyond volume 1 of it now. But yeah.
Thank you very much. I think you know, this is a personal experience, but it's clearly one of much wider significance and import. I mean, there's even, I think, a hint of intellectual genealogy going on there. So I'm very grateful for that. Are there other questions? I think we might have time for just one final question or comment. But if, yes, Emilio.
Just a very quick one on Browning, which got lost before. I remember where I read something about it. It's Richard Keith's The Days of the Good Soldiers, which is an essay on communists in the armed force in the Second World War. There are a few pages about the role, well, Browning is mentioned 3 times, but a few pages about the role of Birkbeck as a space for communist scholars, basically, that are then involved in the armed forces. But I was thinking about your comment on marginality, because that works for World Bank as well, who spent all his life in Liverpool and had some issues when he, after retiring, got back to Cambridge. So there's something there.
Thank you. I shall pursue you privately on this, if I may.
Very happily. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed to Chris for such a wonderfully stimulating paper. Thank you all for the discussion.